Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. In this episode, we're going to go back into the archives to find an answer to a question from an inspirational teacher. For those of you who are hearing this answer for the second, third, fourth time, and hopefully it's a useful refresher. And for those of you who are hearing it for the first time, hopefully this points you towards an episode that you may want to listen to now. As you're listening, I think it would be fantastic to think about how you might respond to this question. And why not share it in the comments wherever you're listening, whether that be YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I hope it provides useful food for thought for your professional development this year. Without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education.
What are the four most prominent sort of parts or features of a LISA lesson?
I like a LISA lesson. I think it's really evolved over time. And I think there are things that I do in lots of different ways. So I know perhaps some people will respond to this with like set sort of structures or patterns, whereas mine is more themes, I suppose. So the first one being language. I think it's vital that the children know and understand the language that we use in mathematics. You know, you need to be able to speak like a mathematician. So language is a really important feature of all my lessons, whether that be introducing them to the vocabulary, whether that be doing lots of I say, you say type modelling, whether that be, you know, actually literally teaching them those words like you would in a grammar lesson, you know, really diving into the etymology and so on. And so language is something that I have very high expectations with. I'm constantly reinforcing and correcting the children and thinking about how we can best introduce that. So language is one of the key threads, I suppose, running through all of my lessons. The second one would be making connections. So Mike Askew, who I'm actually going to mention later on, talks about the importance of being a connectionist teacher in maths. And that, when I read that and when I sort of really thought about that, it really struck a chord with me because maths is completely interconnected and I'm still learning ways in which it's connected. And so I am constantly reinforcing connections in my lessons. So that might be to, oh, look at what we did yesterday. It might be to, oh, isn't this similar or different to what we did whenever? And also thinking about how I can connect forward as well. So I might say to the children, you know, not just remember this because it's important, but everything's important. But that idea of, you know, just kind of keep this in mind and I will make a note of it so that I can return to it in the future. And so I think making these connections really explicit to the children is very important. The third theme is representation. So representations, it's been really hard in the COVID life to use manipulatives, but we've done what we can. So all of my lessons will have representations of some kind in them, whether that be pictures or whether that be concrete stuff. Thinking about how to expose those children to the underlying relationships and underlying concepts through those representations. So if I don't have a representation in my lesson, something's gone very wrong. And then I think the final sort of theme is reasoning. So this has kind of come from the sort of mathematical thinking understanding that I've done a lot of working with Maths Mastery, and something that I don't see a lot of in classrooms, having been to so many of them. So I try really hard to ensure that there is that mathematical thinking opportunities and reasoning opportunities. And that crops up in so many different ways. So it might be through using variation, it might be through the questions that I ask or the expectations on children to say, well, why? You know, it might be as simple as, well, what do you notice? That kind of thing. But I make sure that all of my lessons just have that element in it, and it's not just me telling them, it's about them thinking about those connections and making those links themselves. So yeah, rather than specific parts, I have themes, I think.
There's no I have no design in mind for the answers to the question, and I think I could definitely get on board with all of those as fundamental. So when you're talking about the connections, what would your advice be to anybody who's not 100% sure about those connections? Where would they go for inspiration?
That's a tricky one. I think there are a lot of books and so on that will support that. I think the new NCTM Ready to Progress document is pretty good for that as well. So obviously we've got that new non-stack guidance that has making connections written in it, but it also allows you to see that kind of snapshot of those key things and allows you to make those links. But I also think it's about exploring for yourself. So it's also about noticing yourself, doing the maths yourself. And I know that must be, I've had the luxury of time to be able to do that. And as a full-time class teacher, probably won't have happened. But being open to thinking about things, and also Twitter. I mean, I've learned so much from Twitter, particularly early years stuff, because that's my sort of less known area. Being able to read blogs and so on and so forth has opened my eyes to the possibilities of connections. So I think lots of different ways. I think as a teacher starting out, asking people as well, asking your maths lead, getting involved with maths comps and things like that, and just having time set aside for once you've asked those questions to actually think about it, which I know can be really hard to find.
Yeah. So what they need is their sort of mentors giving them the time to think about it and stuff, don't they? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that can be, it's so tricky. I can quite happily sit here and say, oh yes, spend an hour a week thinking about maths, but actually, when you've got all the other things you have to think about as a teacher, finding an hour a week can be really challenging, So it's hard. But I think if you want to enable those connections, and I think they're really important, then I think that you do need to invest a bit of time, because you only need to do it once, really, in a sense. You only need to think about how area models are linked to that kind of bus stop division thing, that kind of having one line, a horizontal and vertical line, and that linking to an area model. You only have to think about that once, and then it's there forever. And then you can link it to other things. But I think it is worth investing the time, I think.
Yeah, definitely. They're all great. I think that's great advice. And then just teaching in as many year groups, well, not necessarily in one big go, but a couple of years in 3, a couple of years in 4, and those things sort of start to reveal themselves. I took some of our TAs through GCSE a couple of years ago.
Oh wow!
And in teaching them GCSE, I could say, oh my goodness, that thing from year 4, that thing from year 5, it all started to tie up, and then you're thinking about forward facing and stuff, and so I think just more experience, which is easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think being able to converse with secondary colleagues can be really useful as well, actually. Maths Mastery had a secondary arm, and although I never worked directly with the secondary team, when they were looking at rewriting year 7, year 8 materials, of course, as primary people, were useful for thinking about how those kind of key themes and ideas work their way through the curriculum.